From the moment I stepped into the glass and marble lobby of the company, I knew I was in someone else's world, one that gleamed with excess and reeked of entitlement. The CEO's name was whispered like royalty in the hallways, though the only crown he seemed to wear was his ego. His office, perched on the top floor like a throne room, boasted floor-to-ceiling windows, designer furniture, and an art collection that could bankrupt a small country. Employees hustled around, eyes darting nervously, their smiles forced, and their steps hesitant, because he thrived on control and craved the subtle tremor of fear in every subordinate. He had a way of belittling even the smallest gestures of competence. I had seen him scoff at a secretary for misspelling a single word, and he dismissed the IT team for not anticipating his whims. As the janitor, I was the invisible machine, quietly scrubbing floors while he stumped past in silk suits, barking orders that seemed designed more to assert dominance than accomplish anything. He demanded perfection in every inch of his empire, yet offered no empathy, no humanity, only a mirror to reflect his obsession with wealth, status, and absolute control. Even the staff cafeteria, with its gleaming silver trays and expensive imported coffee, felt like a stage where he watched us squirm, silently noting who dared to breathe without permission. No one dared make eye contact for too long, and I learned to step lightly, to vanish in plain sight. The CEO's presence was suffocating, and the higher-ups seemed complicit in maintaining his untouchable aura, nodding at his whims as if agreeing with a law no one else had written. Every interaction carried a subtle threat, an invisible line we couldn't cross without risking humiliation, or worse. He wasn't just rich. He was meticulously performative about it. Each day, he arrived in a new luxury car, followed by a parade of assistants, security, and flattery. He measured people by how they reacted to his wealth and used it as leverage to manipulate respect, obedience, and fear. Nothing happened in that building that didn't revolve around his ego. I watched as colleagues tiptoed around office politics, their professional pride eroded by his need to dominate every conversation and decision. In this kingdom of glass and greed, the janitor's broom and mop were as invisible as I was, and yet I saw everything, every slight, every injustice, every calculated smirk meant to remind us that in his world, we existed only at his pleasure. I've always believed that hard work should speak for itself, even if no one else bothers to listen. As the janitor in that tar and glass palace of wealth, my days began before sunrise, mopping floors that reflected the CEO's gold-plated ambitions and wiping surfaces that no one else would touch. People rarely noticed me. If they did, it was only to scowl or hurry past. But I took pride in my work, in the small victories of cleanliness and order, because it was the one thing I could control in a world where everyone else seemed obsessed with appearances and power. Some mornings, as I scrubbed the marble floors, I'd flash back to my own family, to the nights I stayed late at work so my younger sister could eat before bedtime or my mother could rest. I remembered borrowing extra hours at odd jobs to cover school fees, sacrificing weekends so that they could have moments of joy I couldn't afford myself. Those memories carried both warmth and ache. They reminded me that dignity wasn't measured by wealth, but by responsibility, resilience, and quiet courage. I carried that sense of purpose with me even in the most humiliating moments at work. I often thought about how my life contrasted with the world inside those glass walls. My clothes were simple, worn, practical, never flashy. My hands bore calluses, and my shoulders a subtle stoop from years of labor. Yet, inside, I held a quiet pride that no one could see. While the CEO and his minions measured value in promotions and titles, I measured it in being able to look my family in the eyes without shame. That sense of integrity was my armor against the constant belittlement, the rolling eyes, the whispered complaints about how slowly I moved, or how unnoticed my efforts were. Even in the corridors, where laughter echoed from corporate meetings, I felt my own invisible pulse of determination. I reminded myself daily that my worth was not defined by recognition from people like him, by nods from the powerful, or even by applause. My worth lay in my perseverance, my ability to endure humiliation without breaking, and my dedication to my family who depended on me. At night, when the office lights dimmed and the polished floors reflected the empty corridors, I allowed myself a small smile, knowing that while I may be invisible to the world, I was steadfast, unbroken, and quietly triumphant in my own way. Every mop stroke, every polished surface, every unnoticed effort was a silent protest against the world's obsession with wealth and status. It was my reminder that dignity wasn't loud, and that sometimes the most powerful victories begin in the shadows, far from the eyes of the arrogant and entitled. I carried that conviction into every day, silently observing, quietly learning, and preparing for the moments when the tables might turn. That morning, the air in the office felt heavier than usual, thick with anticipation and a quiet fear that seemed to hum beneath the fluorescent lights. I was pushing the mop down the hall when the CEO's voice boomed from the boardroom, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the usual hum of keyboards and muted conversations. Effective immediately, he declared, all staff must submit to the new performance review system. Compliance is mandatory, and failure will have consequences. No explanation, no discussion, just a proclamation designed to instill obedience and remind everyone who truly ruled this place. I paused for a moment, feeling the cold weight of those words settle over me. Performance reviews for the janitorial staff were unheard of. This was not a department where efficiency was measured in charts or KPIs. But in his empire, rules were as arbitrary as his whims, and those at the bottom of the hierarchy were always the first to feel the squeeze. I could see my coworkers stiffen, exchanging uneasy glances. But there was no murmured protest, only the recognition that dissent was dangerous. I reminded myself of the countless hours I had already poured into keeping the office spotless, the invisible labor that allowed meetings to proceed, floors to gleam, and surfaces to reflect the CEO's grandeur. Yet, in his eyes, none of that mattered. He saw me not as a person or even as a hard-working employee, but as a replaceable cog, a fixture whose existence depended entirely on his indulgence. The power imbalance was staggering. His words carried consequences I had no voice to challenge. His arbitrary authority could undo years of dedication in an instant. I could feel my chest tighten, the familiar knot of anxiety forming. But I tried to keep moving, trying to act normal while absorbing the weight of the threat. Each step I took seemed to echo in the polished halls, a reminder that every floor I cleaned, every task I completed, could be rendered meaningless by a single pronouncement. In that moment, the injustice of the hierarchy pressed down on me. Hard work and loyalty were irrelevant when the whims of the powerful dictated who was safe and who would be cast aside. Then came the quiet, almost imperceptible smirk on his face as he scanned the room. My stomach dropped when I realized that I was the target of his attention. He stepped closer, voice low but sharp enough for me to hear. I want to see you in my office after lunch. We need to discuss your future here. That forward line carried more weight than any threat I had ever received. It was not a request or a conversation starter, it was a signal. My job, my stability, my quiet dignity was now in jeopardy, dangling in the balance of his capricious desire for control. I first noticed the child one afternoon while pushing my mop through the main hallway. She was small, barely reaching the polished railing, with bright, curious eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. And like the adults bustling through the office, weighed down by hierarchy, fear, or ambition, she moved with a lightness and wonder that felt almost alien in this building. She asked questions incessantly about paintings, the building's history, even the security cameras, and her voice carried a clarity that pierced the fog of arrogance that filled the place. It didn't take long to realize she noticed things the adults refused to see. While my coworkers bowed their heads, avoiding the CEO's gaze, she lingered, watching him bark at people, noticing the subtle grimaces and whispered complaints, as if she understood the unfairness before it was even named. There was an honesty in her gaze, a moral compass that didn't need correction or explanation. She seemed to sense the small cruelties, the microaggressions, the moments where power overshadowed decency, and she remembered them in a way that made the world feel just slightly less impenetrable. Sometimes she would approach me, a wide smile lighting up her face, asking why I cleaned the floors so carefully, or why some adults were so unkind. I found myself explaining, carefully choosing words, realizing she was absorbing lessons about fairness and dignity that most adults in this building had long forgotten. In her presence, I felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. Hope because someone so young could see truth clearly, and fear because her innocence made the stark injustices here even harder to ignore. She became a quiet observer, almost a guardian of conscience, reminding me that even in a world dominated by power and ego, morality and courage could exist, waiting for the right moment to surface. Her presence was a subtle, shining contrast to the oppressive energy that filled the CEO's empire, and I began to sense that the balance of power might not be as absolute as it seemed. That afternoon, as I polished the marble floor near the main conference room, I overheard a whispered conversation between two of the CEO's assistants. They were smirking as they recounted how the CEO had assigned me to clean the executive lounge during the board meeting, a task meant to humiliate me, ensuring I would be seen as nothing more than a lowly fixture in his empire. My hands paused on the mop handle, and a familiar heat of frustration rose in my chest. I reminded myself to breathe, to keep calm, even as the injustice pricked at every nerve. I had endured this before, but each calculated slight still cut deeper than the last. The subtlety of it made it worse. Nobody called me out. Nobody outright mocked me to my face. Yet every glance, every whispered chuckle, carried the weight of power. A reminder that my place in this world was measured by obedience and invisibility. I felt a quiet tension build in my stomach, the slow burn anxiety of someone who knows the world can turn on them at any moment, simply because someone more powerful decided it. And yet, in the midst of this humiliation, a strange awareness began to take root. I was the one still standing, still moving, still enduring, while others' cruelty reflected back on them, not me. As I scrubbed the floors, I thought of my family, of the sacrifices I had made that no one here would ever acknowledge. I had learned to measure value differently. While they measured me by status and power, I measured myself by resilience and integrity. That quiet reflection strengthened something in me, a hidden flame that whispered I was more than their mockery, more than their schemes. Even as the CEO's minions carried out their subtle sabotage, misplacing cleaning supplies, ignoring my requests for basic support, I began to notice a shift in myself. Where before I might have shrunk, now I held my posture straighter, moved with a quiet dignity that defied their expectations. I could feel the narrative of the building subtly changing, as if the unseen audience, the people observing without speaking, were starting to root for the one who endured, the one who persevered against unfairness. By the end of the day, the humiliation had been administered, small and calculated, yet it sparked an internal reckoning. I realized that endurance alone could be a form of resistance, and that sometimes the smallest victories were in holding one's head high when everyone else expects you to bow. That slow, simmering tension, the awareness that this struggle was far from over, lingered like a shadow, preparing both me and the unseen audience for the inevitable moments when the balance of power would shift. A few days later, while emptying the office trash, I noticed a colleague struggling to carry a stack of heavy files. No one offered help. The CEO was in his office, barking instructions, and the higher-ups pretended not to see. Without thinking, I stepped forward, lifting the boxes and carrying them to her desk. She glanced at me, startled, then smiled, a small, genuine expression that felt heavier than any praise the CEO could give. It was a simple act, almost invisible, yet it reminded me that dignity and decency still mattered, even in a building ruled by arrogance. Later, I found a lost folder in the hallway, filled with confidential documents that could have caused panic if misplaced. I returned it to the executive assistant without fanfare. She whispered a quiet thank you, eyes flicking toward the CEO's office as if acknowledging the subtle rebellion inherent in my action. In that moment, I realized that power isn't always held in money or titles. It can also exist in small, deliberate choices that show compassion and integrity. Even the child noticed. She watched from across the hallway, tilting her head, as if cataloging the moments adults missed. I caught her curious gaze and gave a small nod, silently acknowledging that kindness, no matter how modest, can ripple outward. That quiet awareness, the knowledge that one can act morally and still survive, even in an environment designed to humiliate, was exhilarating. It hinted that the hierarchy wasn't absolute, that cracks existed, and that even small acts could destabilize the rigid structures of cruelty. By the end of the day, as I returned to my mop and bucket, I carried a sense of quiet triumph. The CEO might command respect through fear, but he could not dictate my choices or my conscience. That subtle shift, almost imperceptible, planted a seed. Power could be contested, even quietly, and the smallest gestures could lay the groundwork for far larger victories. It happened during the midday meeting, in the gleaming boardroom where everyone felt compelled to perform loyalty like actors on a stage. The CEO's presence filled the room before he even spoke. His eyes scanned the gathered employees, lingering just a moment too long on me. Then, with a sudden snap of his hand, he pointed directly in my direction. "I'm considering letting you go," he said, voice sharp and cold, each word punctuated like a gavel striking the table. A hush fell over the room. Colleagues stiffened, their eyes darting nervously to one another. You could feel the tension coil like a spring in the air, and I realized that all the subtle power plays I had endured until now had led to this moment of blatant, public threat. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to meet his gaze, even briefly, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. The room seemed to shrink, the polished floor reflecting not just the CEO's arrogance, but the silent fear of everyone who witnessed it. I caught glimpses of my co-workers' faces, tight smiles, quick glances, whispered breaths as if even they were holding themselves hostage to his mood. This wasn't just about me. It was a reminder to everyone that no one was safe when power could be exercised so arbitrarily. As he continued, his words layered with implied judgment, I felt a strange mixture of shame, anger, and defiance stirring inside me. I thought of all the mornings I had arrived early, stayed late, and worked in silence, unseen, unnoticed, yet essential to the daily life of the empire he controlled. And now, in a single sentence, he dismissed all of it. My mind raced, imagining the questions whispered in hallways, the rumors that would circulate, the silent calculation in every observer's head. Would he really let the janitor go? The CEO leaned back, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as if daring me to react. The entire boardroom felt suspended, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye was on me, and I realized that my every possible response or failure to respond was being dissected. The threat was no longer hypothetical. It had taken physical form, sharp and immediate. And as I stood there, gripping my mop handle with a tension I couldn't release, the unspoken question lingered, heavy and suffocating. Would he actually follow through? Or was this just another game? A display of dominance designed to remind everyone where the real power lay. It was later that afternoon, in the bustling executive lounge, that everything shifted in a way I never could have predicted. The CEO was mid-rant, berating a junior manager for a minor scheduling error. His voice sharp, his posture rigid, every ounce of his authority on display. The room felt suffocating, tension hanging like a storm cloud, and I watched as colleagues flinched and murmured behind him. Then, almost imperceptibly, the child appeared at the doorway, clutching a small notebook, her wide eyes fixed entirely on him. In that moment, the world seemed to slow, as if everyone instinctively sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. She took a tentative step forward, her voice calm yet impossibly clear in a charged room. "That's not fair, Dad," for words. That was all it took. The CEO froze mid-sentence, his words dying on his lips. Silence swept over the room like a wave, and I felt my heart thrum wildly in my chest. Everyone turned to look, the tension shifting instantly from fear of him to shock at the audacity and simplicity of her observation. Those four words stripped away the layers of power, arrogance, and cruelty he had carefully cultivated. I watched him blink, flustered, a flush creeping across his face. The smirk he usually wore with calculated dominance was gone, replaced with a flicker of uncertainty. For the first time, the room didn't seem entirely under his control. His colleagues exchanged subtle glances, sensing the imbalance, realizing that the impenetrable wall of authority had a crack, and it had been exposed by the innocence of a child. In that instant, I felt a surge of hope and vindication. All the subtle injustices, the quiet humiliations I had endured, the countless acts of unnoticed labor, seemed to converge in this single moment. The power dynamics, meticulously maintained for years, had shifted imperceptibly yet irreversibly. The CEO's authority, once absolute, now wavered under the weight of truth so pure it demanded acknowledgement. The child's words were both simple and devastating. They exposed the moral failing at the core of his empire, and for the first time, I sensed that justice was no longer distant or abstract. After the child's words echoed through the lounge, the CEO's usual composure faltered. His face, once an impenetrable mask of arrogance, now betrayed confusion and vulnerability. He stammered, searching for a retort, but no clever insult or threat could undo the truth she had so effortlessly spoken. I watched him shrink, not physically, but in presence, the aura of dominance evaporating under the gaze of everyone in the room. Colleagues who had cowered moments before began to straighten in their seats, subtle nods and half smiles signaling a shift in perception. For the first time, I felt a swell of confidence rising inside me. All the hours of unnoticed labor, the quiet perseverance under relentless belittlement, had not gone entirely unseen. The contrast was stark. The weak, cruel ego of the CEO crumbling versus the quiet, unassuming strength I had carried for years. Where I had once moved cautiously, wary of his whims, I now walked with a subtle certainty. Each step a silent assertion that my dignity was untouchable. I could see it in the smallest details, the way he avoided direct eye contact, the slight hesitation in his gestures, the tone of voice that now carried uncertainty rather than command. I had been dismissed, overlooked, and mocked countless times, yet here I was, standing upright, feeling the validation that comes not from accolades, but from enduring injustice with integrity. The rejected, underestimated figure in the room was now quietly respected, a fact that shifted the energy around us. Even the child watched with wide, approving eyes, as if silently cheering, the balance of power tilting ever so slightly. Every whispered exchange among employees now carried a new subtext. The janitor, who had been invisible, the one they assumed powerless, was not only present but poised. The CEO, once untouchable, was visibly shaken, and I could sense that every small action I had taken, the unseen kindnesses, the quiet endurance, was culminating in this moment of subtle but undeniable reversal. The scales had shifted, and for the first time in years, I felt the exhilarating truth. Strength often lives in those who are overlooked, and power, even seemingly absolute, can crumble when challenged by honesty, integrity, and resilience. The next morning, the CEO called a mandatory meeting, and a tense murmur ran through the office. Employees filed in cautiously, sensing the storm about to break. When he stepped onto the podium, his usual swagger was replaced by a tight stiffness. He cleared his throat, scanning the room, and I could see the remnants of yesterday's humiliation lingering on his face. Yesterday, he began, hesitating as if measuring the weight of his words. I allowed my judgment to be clouded. The pause was almost comical, but the room stayed silent, eyes fixed on him, including mine. One of the managers spoke up, voice steady. "Sir, your comments about the janitor yesterday were unnecessary and demoralizing." The staff noticed, and frankly, it reflected poorly on leadership. The CEO's jaw tightened. Yes, perhaps I overreacted," he admitted, the words tasting foreign. I failed to recognize fairness. Murmurs of agreement swept the room. Employees exchanged glances, feeling vindicated. The child, standing near the back, smiled faintly, a quiet witness to the consequences of arrogance meeting truth. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and relief. The CEO, who had once dominated this space with fear and bluster, was now apologizing publicly, admitting that his behavior had been wrong. I realize now, he continued, voice faltering slightly, that I have underestimated people who work quietly, who show integrity without seeking praise. Your work matters, whether or not I acknowledged it. My heart swelled not with malice, but with the justice of seeing recognition delivered where it had long been due. A colleague leaned toward me and whispered. Finally, someone spoke up. About time he faced reality. I nodded, my chest tight with quiet pride. The room hummed with an unspoken acknowledgement. The tyrant's empire was shaken, not through confrontation or rebellion, but through observation, honesty, and undeniable truth. The CEO, though still in his position, had been humbled, his arrogance exposed and corrected, even if partially, by the very people he had sought to dominate. The child's voice cut through softly, almost innocently. See, you can't just boss people around. The CEO's blush deepened. He gave a small, awkward nod. You're right, he admitted, and the office collectively exhaled. It was subtle, yet the impact was enormous. The arrogance stripped away, the hierarchy momentarily leveled. Karma, I realized, didn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it crept quietly, humbling the proud in ways everyone could witness, leaving the wronged quietly vindicated, and the powerful painfully aware of their failings. After the fallout, the office felt different, though the marble floors and glass walls remained the same. There was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet respect that had been absent before. One morning, the HR manager approached me as I was emptying the trash near the executive wing. You've done exceptional work, she said, her voice warm, tinged with relief. We want to formally recognize your contributions. There is even a small adjustment to your role, reflecting the responsibility you've consistently shown. I nodded, swallowing a lump in my throat, knowing that this acknowledgement was more than a title. It was validation of years spent enduring, persevering, and remaining true to myself. I paused for a moment, reflecting on everything that had led here. The countless days of unseen labor, the humiliation endured under the CEO's whims, and the small acts of integrity that no one else noticed. It struck me how resilience isn't loud or flashy. It's quiet, stubborn, and patient. Every mop stroke, every careful attention to detail, every time I held my head high despite ridicule had built toward this subtle but meaningful triumph. The recognition felt like justice, not only for me, but for the principle that integrity eventually matters. Even in the shadow of arrogance, walking through the office that day, I noticed subtle nods from colleagues, brief smells that conveyed unspoken acknowledgement. The child waved at me from the corner of the hallway, eyes bright, as if silently saying, "You deserve this." I allowed myself a quiet smile in return, realizing that humility and patience had their own power, and that even in a world dominated by ego, the smallest acts of decency could shift perception and inspire respect. For a moment, I let myself bask in the relief, the emotional closure of seeing that justice doesn't always need to be explosive. Some victories are measured in quiet triumphs, the knowledge that enduring cruelty with dignity can reshape the world around you, and that the respect of those who witness it, however subtle, carries more weight than fear ever could. I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for recognition, but for the reminder that integrity and perseverance are their own rewards, capable of transforming the most toxic environments into spaces where humanity can prevail. Weeks later, as the office settled into a rhythm that no longer trembled under fear, I found myself reflecting on how everything had shifted with such unexpected subtlety. The CEO, once a towering figure of arrogance, now moved through the halls with a careful humility, his authority tempered by the lesson delivered in for simple words. That's not fair, Dad. It amazed me how a child's observation so innocent, so unassuming could unravel years of unchecked ego and injustice. Those words had not only exposed cruelty, but sparked a ripple of reflection and accountability that no power or wealth could suppress. I thought about all the invisible battles I had fought, scrubbing floors while enduring whispered mockery, returning lost documents quietly, performing small acts of kindness in a world that rewarded cruelty. The child's intervention illuminated something I had known all along. True strength and justice often reside in the overlooked, in the humble, in the persistent. The four words were a reminder that moral clarity does not require authority, only courage and honesty, and that even the most entrenched hierarchies can be challenged by truth. There was a bittersweet quality to it all. The CEO's transformation was gradual, imperfect, and in some ways, still fragile. But watching him hesitate before issuing commands, seeing his tone soften when interacting with staff, and noticing the newfound respect among colleagues reminded me that change, however small, could alter the entire emotional landscape of a workplace. It was empowering to recognize that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through integrity, resilience, and the clarity of an innocent observer. As I walked past the polished floors that once symbolized oppression, now carrying a sense of quiet triumph, I realized the real lesson was not in revenge or humiliation, but in steadfastness and moral courage. The child's four words had shattered arrogance and opened a door to reflection. But it was my years of patience, dignity, and quiet perseverance that allowed the shift to resonate. In the end, power and wealth proved less important than integrity, and I understood that enduring injustice with strength could quietly, irrevocably, create justice. Months later, the office had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The CEO, once untouchable and domineering, now approached decisions with caution and, increasingly, empathy. I noticed him listening more, pausing before criticism, and even acknowledging contributions without fanfare. His arrogance had softened into a humility born from confrontation with truth and awareness sparked by the child's simple yet powerful observation. She remained a quiet observer, her presence a constant moral compass, reminding everyone that fairness and honesty could not be ignored. As for me, my life felt lighter. Recognition had brought a modest promotion, yes, but more importantly, it brought peace. I moved through my work with renewed dignity, no longer shrinking in the shadow of fear. Simple moments or colleagues, grateful glance, a sincere thank you reminded me that quiet perseverance carries weight, even if unnoticed at first. The child, still curious and unassuming, continued to watch, question, and challenge small injustices, her innocence a guiding force for everyone around her. I realized that hope, integrity, and moral clarity often manifest in unexpected forms, and that courage need not be loud to be transformative. In the end, the office became more than a workplace. It became a subtle testament to the power of resilience, empathy, and truth. One afternoon, I found the child sitting cross-legged on the floor, carefully arranging a line of paper clips as if building a tiny city. I asked what she was doing, expecting some whimsical answer, and she looked up with a serious expression. "These are the workers who make the office run," she said. "See, even paper clips have jobs. Just like you." I laughed quietly. This sounds strange, but freeing in the otherwise tense office. Later, she insisted I join her game, handing me a paperclip and declaring I was the hero janitor saving the city. I played along, carefully placing my piece among hers. For a few minutes, the polished marble and glass towers of the office disappeared, replaced by a miniature world where work mattered and kindness won. It was silly, it was heartwarming, and it reminded me that sometimes laughter and innocence hold more power than any promotion or recognition. Even in a place built on ego and fear, joy could still sneak in, quietly transforming the day.